Another week, another devlog, another promise to make it short. This time I might actually deliver because I didn't do that much this week. I did a little bit of thinking, a little bit of like concept design in my mind. I did a lot of modeling, but I can go over that fairly quickly. So let's get into what I did for my own game first, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the Game Jam game, which is quickly coming to an end. Next week I'll deliver you guys a download link for that, just because I would give it to you now, but it's not uploaded yet. So maybe if you're watching this 23rd of November or later, there will be a link down below in the description. Otherwise, let's get into my own game first. I didn't do a lot. I did two things, one of which is just like design related thinking, one of which is actually practical. Let's take a look, because I'm live recording my screen right now. Let's take a look at the engine right here, because I made a double jump particle system. So when I double jump, I now leave these little spheres. These are very much temporary. The way it works is I can show you real quick if I go to my very well put together thing here, which is right over here. So this is the particle system that I'm using. So it's literally just it's spawning these meshes. I can just put any mesh in here. I'll probably make some other mesh later, but for the time being, this will do. It changes color over time from purple to light blue. It changes scale over time. It's a relatively simple particle system, but it does the trick, right? So it happens when you double jump. It happens when you dash in the air. It does not happen when you dash when starting on the ground. I really need to remove that end level trigger because we're not going to be using it. It's just for testing purposes. So it does give like a lot more player feedback. And as you can see, if I fall first before do my first jump, it also doesn't. It just, when you do a jumping action in midair, it applies, like it spawns those particles. It's a fairly easy and simple system, but as you can see, it does work relatively well. So that's all the practical things that I did throughout this last week on the game, like in the engine itself. This means that we're getting very, very close to being able to actually build a test build for people. A couple of things that I still need/want to do is there's a one type of enemy all the way back here. Hold on. I think it's called stomping enemy. Enemy up down. That's it. These enemies, as you can see right here, they don't have a mesh yet. They're just placeholders at the moment. I still need to come up with what I want to make those, because I designed the ID. Well, I didn't design the ID. I just like came up with the ID. It's a fairly simple idea, right? Of an enemy that goes up and down, and the way that works. But I didn't actually think about how they would look. So I need to still come up with that and then make that. Doesn't seem like it's going to be something overly complicated. It's probably just going to be like a log that stomps up and down or something like that. Something relatively easy to make and to potentially animate a little bit in. And then I also need to start adding a couple of sound effects. Not that many of them. I'm going to look into having a footstep sound system that should just work. I don't know exactly how it will work, but I imagine there's systems in place for that, so that I have very subtle sounds when you're walking around, but that also should then immediately, in theory, I believe, give me a landing sound when I land from a jump. So that's most of the things that I want. At that point, I only need to actually like include a simple jumping sound itself, and then the sound design for this first build is kind of done. So there's only a couple of very small things that I still need to do before we can start sending this out to people. So next week, next devlog, I'm expecting to be able to tell you I've sent it to people. And if you want to be one of those people, link down below in the description to the Discord. Join the Discord. Let me know that you want to be a beta tester. I'll add you to the beta tester channel and we can have a lot of fun. And I'll just keep you up to date with like links and stuff to download. So that's that. Now moving on to the second thing that I did this week for this game. And that is, as it is right now, this game, this level is very linear. And the gimmick or the theme of it is very much based on when you walk up to a obstacle, as you could see here before I'll quickly play back to it. You have two obstacle choices. Well, you don't have a choice. You have two obstacles that could potentially move in to let you complete that portion of the level. And that's chosen at random. And there's like 3 or 4 of those. This time we get the other one, right? And that's meant to like thematically tie into the idea that this is a video edit, and you will be swapping out portions of that, like just put this in there, put that in there, all that kind of good stuff. So what I was thinking is I can keep that in potentially, but I can also do something else, because swapping in and out things means that throughout the editing process of a video or of a film or of whatever, right? You actually end up making numerous different versions of that end product. Only one of which is going to get published, but you actually end up making those and oftentimes discarding entire sections of it and replacing that. And there's another way that I could maybe visualize that in a more gameplay oriented way than I'm doing right now. I think what I'm doing right now thematically does make sense, and it's a lot easier than the idea that I'm about to explain. But what if you have, and for this I have a Photoshop file. Okay, I had to set up my drawing tablet real quick here. It's not going to look very great because number one, I can't draw very well. Number two, the hand-eye coordination for this is really weird. But as the level is right now, we have it looking a little like this, right? We have the start of the level, we have the end of the level, and we just move that direction. There's some obstacles in the way, but it's very, very linear. And looking at the theme of the level, which is switching out elements at the moment, we could also do something else instead that's more akin to classic Sonic games, where you have multiple routes through the levels, and you can more or less switch between those routes at certain intersection points. That's more or less how those 2D classic Sonic games work. Not exactly, but more or less. So what if, for instance, we have, like here 10% into the level or something, we have a little side path, and that side path goes like this, right? And then it intersects and it goes on its own merry way towards the end. So here on this intersection point, you can choose to just keep going this way. If you want, go back onto the main path. The idea is that at the end of the day, if there's like 4 or 5 different paths, there really isn't a main path anymore. Or you can choose to keep going on the path you were going on. And then maybe 20% into the level, we have another branch off right here, which intersects with the other branch path, but maybe not the main path. So it does something a little like this, right? And then with height, you can also just like go over. So maybe here you go over the last part, and then you end up, or over the main part even. And then you end up on this direction, and that is how you end up on the end here. And maybe even in these branch paths, we have another branch that just goes here and it intersects, or it goes over. Like there is a lot of opportunity and chances you can have, or maybe even go under it, right? For branching paths and having a more dynamic experience with the level. It's also going to be a hell of a lot more work to make, and a hell of a lot more difficult, technically speaking, to make something like this. But I think this is a very fun idea, specific for the video editing level. One issue that I see here is that I have the preview monitor that's floating around you right now, which, if we do something like this, it's going to be a lot more complicated, because what you want at the end of the day, right? If you are on this intersection right here, this one for instance, you want to, no matter which path you're taking, to see the same part of the movie on your preview monitor when you get to this point. And that's for every single intersection that holds true. And that's going to probably be relatively tricky to get right. So at the moment, I'm thinking maybe I'll do away with the preview monitor following you. I think still something like floating around you is a fun visual theme gimmick that I could maybe use in another level. But at the moment, I'm thinking maybe take that away from this level, and that'll also help me with another issue that I've been thinking about. And that is, at the moment, the level that I'm working on is very, very bare bones. It's like these video editing blocks that you're platforming over. The decoration on both sides is other video editing blocks that are just like floating about, waiting to be used, I suppose you could say. But it's not going to get much more fancy than that. I can just put some like some icons like the cutting tool and the selection tool just floating around in the void to fill up a little bit of empty space. But as far as decoration goes, I don't have a lot of things in this theme that I could be using. So maybe taking away that preview monitor as a following element and just using that as a bigger decoration element throughout the level, just to like fill up a little bit of empty space every so often, will be a better idea, because it prevents me from having to work very tediously on a system where the preview monitor actually like works very well with these intersection parts, and it also fixes one of my other problems, which is decoration for the level itself. So I'm leaning towards doing it that way right now. That being said, for this first build that I'm still working on, that's going to go out hopefully next week, I will not be implementing any of this. It will just be the straight up linear level. That's all that's gonna be in there. So if you're expecting a it might not be next week actually. I still need to make a hub world, so it might be another week. We'll see. The Game Jam game that I've been working on as a 3D modeler is coming to an end, so I need to catch up on some of my own work that I've been slacking off a little bit on and pushing away because I've been busy modeling for that. And then I'll be able to finally get back into this project as well. So, talking about that, because this has been everything about my own game, talking about the Game Jam game now, because I've done quite a few things there as well. I'll try to make it quick, because I see that I've been talking for 15 minutes already. Some of those are going to be cut out, I'm sure. But I made a quick chandelier, and this was a very interesting experience, because probably the most interesting experience of this week's Game Jam modeling. Because you can see probably a render of it right now on screen. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to model all those tiny details. That is fucking insane. Of course, I'm not going to do that. So let's try to do that with texturing and with a see-through textures with an alpha. But I wanted to make that myself, obviously. So I went into Blender, did a little bit of fucking around with math nodes to make the diamond shape to create a pattern. But then having that little shape change into something tileable to use as a pattern procedurally turned out to be very, very complicated in Blender, because Blender just lacks the nodes to do that. You can do it specifically just with the right kind of math, but while I'm decent enough at math, I'm not like any kind of math genius, and a lot of the functions that these math nodes have, I don't actually quite understand what they do. Sometimes I just copy them from tutorials. I'm like, okay, that works, and okay, so it affects the image in this way, but I have no idea what it's doing mathematically speaking, which means that you can copy things, you can slightly change things, but you can't then incorporate them inside of your own systems because you don't know how they work. And I had a problem with tiling it as a tiled texture, and I needed that because obviously the chandelier. So I went looking a little bit online, and it seems like Substance Designer, we're talking about that again, does have a node which is literally just like take this procedural information and tile it. It's more or less, as far as I understand, it's taking procedural information and using it like Blender would use an image texture. But it should still keep its infinite resolution until you actually like start exporting it into a texture file, I think. So that's another point in the direction of moving to Substance Painter. I'm not going to do that right now because I've more or less finished all the work on this Game Jam game. It would take too much time to get acquainted with this software for this Game Jam game. And it's going to be a little while before we get to the point where I'm actually like texturing my own models again for my own projects here. So it's going to be a couple of months before we move into Substance Designer, but if I'm making more models and I'm actually making somewhat finalized textures for them, I'm going to purchase a license for for Substance Designer. I have decided that now because I'm running into more and more issues within Blender. Again, not saying that Blender cannot do these things, but it's just more complicated and more tedious to do. A very good example, or metaphor rather, that I want to give you is you don't need a multiplication function to multiply numbers. You can do 5 times 6 by just doing 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5. But that's tedious and time consuming. In much the same way, a lot of things that Substance Designer just offers as functions, you can do in Blender. Again, as far as I understand, I'm not a professional at this. You can do in Blender. It's just like manually making multiplication by just adding. Like you can do most mathematical functions by just adding and subtracting in very clever ways, but that's not particularly productive. Like you can even do exponents with just addition, right? If you can do multiplication by just doing 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5, if you string that together a couple of times in a row, you suddenly have an exponent. You're like to the power of like 5 to the power of 6, 100 million trillion. Getting very mathematical here, but you get my point. It's needlessly tedious, and I think moving up over to Substance Designer is going to solve at least part of that problem. So that's something that I more or less decided when working on this chandelier, because it took me way too much time to make something that is actually very simple. And as far as I understand, the making of those shapes and patterns as you do in Blender is also more easy to do in Substance Designer. Together with the fact that Substance Designer just has a blur function, like you're making images. You're making image Blender. Why don't we have just a node that will blur things? We're literally making images. This is one of the rudimentary tools to make images the way you want them to be. Sometimes you don't want everything to be 100% sharp, and especially if you're doing something procedurally, those edges are generally going to be rather sharp. So being able to have control over the amount of blur you put on an edge or on an entire image easily is very, very important, and Blender just doesn't have an option for that. Anyway, I also made an ice block making use of geometry nodes it's the second time I've used them on a model. This is the first time I'm using them on a model that's actually getting used. And what I learned there is that if you're using geometry nodes, which is, it's probably going to get more useful as we go along, but at the moment it's more or less a better version of a hair particle system, right? You can pick models and put them onto other models. I think you can also like deform models based on the position towards other models. You can animate models using it. You can do a lot of things with it. I just use it as a hair particle system with more control over certain things. So what I learned is very quickly you get a lot of vertices, because in my first version of this ice block I had like 25 million vertices, which is way too much to run in a game engine. So I had to scale that down significantly. I ended up with something like 7,500 vertices, 6,500 I think even, which is a lot better. A very easy thing to make, but it's fun to play with the geometry nodes. I really need to figure out more about those, because it's a really nice way to procedurally add like little details like spikes, for instance, in this case, but for grass, for instance, as well. Grass systems and stuff like that. Not that that matters too much, because if you're adding grass for a game, you're doing it in engine, not in Blender, but still. We also made a Starfish. This was actually a lot of fun, because this was another one where I was like, okay, this is a very interesting thing for texturing purposes. For modeling, it wasn't that difficult. I animated it a little bit as well. It's mostly a texturing thing, and I really enjoyed making this because you have a lot of like data. I'm using these group of nodes to make this part of the texture look this way, but then I can use those exact same nodes to do something else with and make a normal map so that it looks more complicated in lighting than is actually there in geometry, right? Those kind of things. I've never made a manual normal map. Usually when I add a normal map, it's either from baking a higher poly mesh into a lower poly mesh, or it's literally just a Google image or from like another material to add things like fingerprints or scratches or whatever surface imperfections through a normal map that I just downloaded. Making a custom normal map on my own based on procedural textures I hadn't done before, and that was a very interesting and fun way to do things. Not too much to talk about there, but it was fun to experiment around with. Another thing that I experimented around with, and that's the last thing we're going to talk about this week, is photogrammetry. And if you don't know what that is, it's taking a lot of pictures of an object in 3D space, just in the real world, like take this Switch controller, for instance. Also, I bought a Switch. I just like taking pictures all around it, the top view, bottom view, like take like 100 or so pictures of it and load it into a piece of software that will analyze that and reconstruct a 3D model of it. And I wanted to test that out, and I wanted to play around with it, experiment. I found out that it's not ideal for a lot of purposes for making game assets. I can definitely see for visual effects, for CGI, this being amazing and a time saving. For most, like just making a single object, it doesn't work that great, I don't think. So a long story short, that didn't really end up working out. I'm probably not going to use it for single objects anymore. It's still a good technique and a good tool to know exists out there, and specifically not for making game models, but just for CGI related purposes, which I might have to use at some point in the future for other things that are not game development, right? So it's a good thing to know that we can use that, and the techniques that you can use to make lower poly versions of those scans, because those scans are ridiculously high poly count as well, because obviously it's all machine generated, and as such they just throw as much detail into it as they can. It's not going to be very good for rendering purposes. So what you do is you make a lower poly version of it, and then you apply, like you bake the detail into it. But I'm not going to use that too much for game development, especially since the game that I'm working on myself is a very stylized kind of thing, so we don't need photorealistic textures in that either, so it would just feel out of place anyway. It's nice to have experimented around with it though. I think that's everything for this week. Next week, hopefully I'll have some good news about maybe having a first build to share with people. I'll see you back then. Bye.